You're gonna have to pay the toll.
Hey guys, back again with another video, an impressions video, not a review this time, on a game that unfortunately I'm dropping, and that's Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia. I was actually really looking forward to this game. Now, it's actually the first game I've dropped in 2017. I'd almost also call it my first actual disappointment of the year, but actually I was disappointed with Prey. I talked about that game in my games I've been playing recently video I did not too long ago, and I was actually really positive on that game. But that game absolutely takes a shit in the last act. Like, that game gets really terrible with like constantly respawning enemies, which is kind of funny. It's actually an interesting parallel with this game, which we'll get to that later. But the story kind of gets rushed a little bit. Even though I do like the ending to Prey, the gameplay just really falls apart, and it's way too combat focused. And the way they have respawning enemies is really annoying. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but that game really fell apart for me at the end. So it ultimately ended up being a disappointing game, despite being very positive when I talked about it previously. But that's not the game we're talking about here. We're talking about Fire Emblem Echoes. Now, getting into this series, it's been a recent thing for me. I reviewed Fire Emblem Awakening last year, and then I played through all 3 Fates games, and I played through 4 Fire Emblem games in a row. I did burn myself out a little bit, but I finally got into the series with those games. I really enjoyed my time with them for the most part. Revelations was kind of a bit of a drag, but Conquest especially I loved. So I guess I'm definitely not what you would call a hardcore fan of the series. I haven't gone back to play some of the older ones with the permadeath in them. I do like the series now, so I was looking forward to this game, and I thought I might be a little too burnt out on the series to play this right away, but it turns out leading up to release, I was actually wanting more Fire Emblem. And I started to like this game at first, but the more I played it, the more I disliked it. And there's one certain design decision in particular that completely ruins the game for me. And I guess for most people, it's not a game ruiner. It's one of those things that a lot of people are complaining about, but it's not enough to drag the game down for them or to make them stop playing. But for me, it's one of my biggest pet peeves in games, and it's the way it's implemented is just horrendous. It has to do with the actual map design in this game, but we'll get to that later. Because there's a decent amount to discuss with this game. I think the first thing I want to talk about with this game is how different it is compared to previous games on the 3DS. We're seeing a kind of a shift with the Fire Emblem series where they're getting a little more mainstream and more accessible. And I suppose hardcore Fire Emblem fans are probably a little upset by this. It used to be a really hardcore, like very difficult series, you know, with the permadeath. And then the stories used to be, from what I understand, actually quite compelling, and they've kind of got weaker and weaker with each game. And then the series has started to focus on like the relationship elements for them, and then the marriage part of the game. And then, of course, obviously adding the fact that you can turn off permadeath in these newer entries. So this game is kind of it kind of harkens back to older Fire Emblem games, because it's actually a remake of the second Fire Emblem game on the NES, Fire Emblem Gaiden. And that game was already apparently considered like the black sheep of the series. It wasn't. It was quite different compared to the first Fire Emblem. From what I understand, it had an overworld and towns you would visit, and the difficulty level was a lot higher. And then, from what I understand, that the original game, like, the characters have hardly any development to them, and that's one of the things they did change with this remake. Because and then they added a bunch of other stuff as well. But it's weird though. I feel like this is a little more traditional in some ways, but it takes some things from the newer Fire Emblem games as well. Like Fire Emblem Conquest, for instance, went back to the classic Fire Emblem map design where it wasn't just kill every enemy on the map. And that's one of the things I loved about Conquest. Each map has its own different objectives, and the way they were designed was quite clever. And that's what I enjoyed about that game. It kind of set it apart from like Awakening, for instance, where every single mission was kill all the enemies. And then Birthright was kind of boring because every objective was that. It was basically Awakening 2.0, but with a far worse story. and writing and characters. And this game's kind of the same as those games. All the maps in this game are basically kill every enemy, but there's a few different gimmicks that they use that are honestly kind of annoying. Well, we'll get to that later. I don't want to talk about the map design quite yet, but there's a lot of differences between previous Fire Emblem games and this one. And it really threw me for a loop at first. And I gotta say, it's a lot of people, I guess, are liking these changes. For the most part, I don't like them. I honestly prefer how things were handled in previous Fire Emblem games on the 3DS. There's one change that I think is good, and it's something I hope they bring back in future Fire Emblem games. But for the most part, these changes I wasn't a huge fan of. For one, the weapon triangle is gone. That's right, there's no rock, paper, scissors type weaknesses and strengths in this game. Instead, it's basically removed. So different weapons, different weapons are going to be still kind of better against certain units, but there's no actual weakness thing going on anymore. So a bow is not going to be absolutely devastating to like Pegasus Knights, for instance. And it's weird. I always felt like the rock, paper, scissors. It's not one of those changes that I absolutely hate, but I kind of like the strategy involved with the rock, paper, scissors, and a lot of times I feel like what it does for this game, it just makes the enemies take more damage to kill. Of course, it kind of works both ways as well. Your units seem to be able to take more damage in this game against all these different types of weapons, but I don't know, it's a little weird. Another thing that's changed is like the equipment. There's no durability, but each unit can only equip one type of item, whether it be a healing item, a weapon, or a shield. If it's a weapon or shield, you can upgrade it at different blacksmiths throughout the overworld. But yeah, one item at a time, and I feel like that's a little too limited. It can be really annoying, actually. Only being able to equip one item at a time, and the customization in this game in general is far more limited than I was expecting, and I don't know, I wasn't a huge fan of that. I'll admit now, a lot of this stuff is mostly preference, and I do realize that a lot of people like these changes, for a one-off kind of game, I'm fine with them, but they're not something I'd like to see returning in future Fire Emblem games. Now, the one thing that hardcore Fire Emblem fans are probably going to like about this game is that they have toned down the relationship stuff. The pairing up mechanic is completely gone with this game, and the marriage system is gone as well. There's no marrying certain units and having kids that take over their parents' skills and abilities. Nothing like that. You have support conversations that can happen between different characters, but you basically just go into battle and then they'll pop up every so often. You can talk to a character instead of, or use your turn to talk to a certain character, and you'll rank up that support conversation. And so that adds some development to the character, so I do like that that's at least in the game, but I gotta say, I kind of missed the relationship element. That was one of the more engaging parts of the previous Fire Emblem games to me. Is figure out which characters to pair up with each other, and making those child characters and making them really strong. It added a level of I don't know. I don't want to say complexity, but added a level of depth that I definitely was missing here. At the same time, I can understand how hardcore Fire Emblem fans might have been turned off by that kind of stuff in the recent Fire Emblem games. So they'll be right at home here. It's definitely more like classic Fire Emblem in that sense. But I won't lie. Call me a casual, but I really missed that stuff. I don't know. I really did. And I guess I should talk about the overworld in this game. I mean, previous Fire Emblem games have had the overworld, but I guess this was new for the NES game. Where you're basically going from point to point on this map, but enemies will constantly spawn at different locations. So I feel like there's a lot more battles in this game that you have to go through as compared to previous Fire Emblems, which can be a little annoying at times, I must admit. But probably one of the bigger changes with this game is the dungeon crawling, and this is one of the changes with the series that I actually really do like. I think this is actually a really cool idea, and it's fairly well implemented, but I think it could be better. There's definitely room for improvement here, where these dungeons are basically in third person, And you explore these dungeons, and you basically attack enemies with your sword, and you get like preemptive strikes, and you'll get into the typical like turn-based grid battle. But they never really last too long, at least at first, for like the first half of the game. They do start to take way too long in the later parts of the game, and it's more annoying too because the dungeons get longer and longer and longer. But for the most part, the battles go fairly quick, and you can still kind of avoid enemies. Excuse me, in these dungeons, but there's a lot of different pathways in these dungeons. There's very slight puzzle solving. You're rewarded for going off the beaten path. You might find these like fountains that will give extra stats to your characters, which I really appreciated. You might find some really good weapons if you really search well and find like different hidden treasures. The dungeons can have multiple floors. They all look different from one another as well. You know, they're not terribly complex or anything. And I do think there might be a little too many battles in them, and some of the later dungeons go on for way too long, but I actually liked this.
What's that shrine?
So the way you upgrade your classes and your units is different in this game as well. There's no more master seals. Instead, each character kind of starts at a certain class, and then once they level up enough, you can change their class at a Mila statue, and these are these statues that are in some of these dungeons. So anytime you want to upgrade a character, you have to actually sometimes backtrack to the previous Mila statue or the closest Mila statue, and go through dungeons that you've already gone through again, which is kind of annoying. I don't know. I didn't mind this system so much in this game, but I kind of prefer the Master Seals, the way you upgraded characters in previous Fire Emblems. I believe this is what it was like in the original game, though, in the NES game. I think. Like, obviously they were trying to stay faithful to that, the original game in a lot of ways. I can appreciate that. But, I don't know. I wasn't crazy about the class change system in this game. I guess one thing that I thought was kind of interesting, it's not beneficial now to keep your characters until they're level 20 and then rank them up. It's actually better to just level up your characters right away, which, I don't know, I kind of liked, but yeah, that's another one of those differences with this game. Another mechanic in this game, this is actually a change that I do like as well. And this ties in with the story, but it's called Mila's Turn Wheel. And what this is, it's a system that allows you to basically reverse turns, and the farther you get into the game, the more turns you can reverse. So if you make mistakes, or one of your characters dies, you can actually reverse turns, and this isn't something that you can constantly keep doing, so it's not broken. You have a certain amount of uses, basically, for each battle. So you can't abuse it or anything like that, but it gives you some leeway, and it made me want to play on permadeath, and I started on permadeath, and I quickly realized I was making a mistake, because this game is actually really difficult. It might be the hardest game. Well, actually Conquest is probably the hardest, but after that, this one's definitely the hardest, and it gets harder, especially in the second half. And I'm just terrible at Fire Emblem games, and it's like, even with the turn wheel, I was losing characters constantly, and it was really frustrating, so I quickly abandoned that idea. But even with like the casual mode turned on, like the game was still fairly tough. And that Mila's turn wheel definitely helped. But it makes it so that you can actually attempt permadeath for people that have been kind of turned off by it in the past. You're given a bit of more leeway with your mistakes in this one, which I definitely appreciated. And I think it's something that I wish, or I think should be carried over into the newer Fire Emblem games as well. Obviously, they'll have to change it because the mechanic has like this story reason why it acts the way it does, but I'd like to see it return for sure. Magic is a little different, works a little differently in this game as well, and this is, from what I understand, the same as it was in the original game, where every time you use a spell, it actually reduces your health, unlike the mage characters. And the mages are really like they're pretty much OP in the first half of the game, but in the second half of the game they actually get quite a bit weaker because oftentimes it's not worth the trade-off. it will reduce like a lot of health to pull off some of the stronger spells. And then if you end up reducing your health, you might end up getting like one-shotted quite easily. I found like the melee characters got a lot better later in the game, but archers are the best units in this game, hands down, from what I saw. Because they don't have the health loss, but they still have the ranged attacks. They can attack from like crazy far away. They can even attack right directly to units, unlike previous games. Yeah, archers are incredibly strong in this game. Honestly, way too strong. They just demolish everything except for like the really tanky type units that you'll find. Yeah, I generally find the balance in this game is actually pretty good. At first, it seemed like it was off because the mages seemed so powerful, but everything kind of evens out in the end, I think. Although there's a lot of really annoying enemy units. We'll get to that. Before I talk about the negatives of this game and basically like the map design, which is what made me drop the game, I guess I should talk about the story too as well. And this is one of those things that a lot of Fire Emblem fans have been disappointed with in recent entries. Fire Emblem Fate's got a lot of shit for its localization, and it's a poorly written story. And I can definitely agree with those people. Although I still thought it was entertaining, at least Fire Emblem Conquest with the over-the-top villain. Birthright was just boring. This game actually has a fairly decent story to it, and the writing is definitely a lot better. 8-4-Play does the localization here, and they did the localization with Fire Emblem Awakening. So it's got a similar level of writing quality, but I think the story here is more interesting. It's kind of like a story I've kind of seen before. You do actually take over two different armies in this game, and two different main characters, Alm and Celica, and they're kind of childhood friends that get torn apart, and then they're both on opposing sides of a war. Now, we've seen this kind of storyline before, but I really do like these types of storylines. And, you know, it's not the most, it's not the most original story or anything, but I think it's engaging for what it is. I do think there are some minor problems. I don't think Celica is an amazing character. A lot of the decisions she makes are just incredibly stupid and annoying. She's honestly kind of an annoying character. Which is a shame because I generally like her characterization, but a lot of the decisions she makes are just like the kind of decisions where you're just like, really, like, come on. So that's a little disappointing. Alm I like, though. I like Alm quite a bit as a character. The characters in general are fairly likable. I like how the support conversations are in this game, and there is a decent amount of development to them, unlike the original game, which apparently the characters were like paper thin in that game. And that's one of the areas they wanted to improve, as well as the story, give a lot more like story background and lore and things like that, which they've added in this remake. Again, nothing amazing. The story is nothing incredible. It's not good enough to make me want to continue on with the game, but it's definitely better than a lot of the previous Fire Emblem games have been in this department. It did remind me of Suikoden 2, though. That game kind of has a similar thing. Childhood friends drifted apart, but the story in that game is so much better. I don't know. I couldn't help but be reminded of that game and how much better that game was as far as its story goes. And then that game had a really compelling villain. This game, there's quite a few antagonists in this game, but the one antagonist is not super compelling either. But anyways, visuals are generally the same as previous Fire Emblem games. One thing I will say, the voice acting, there's a lot more voice acting in this game. Pretty much every line of dialogue is voiced, which I really appreciated. And yeah, I definitely liked that. But in terms of like the presentation, it's not a whole lot different than the previous games. But now we're going to end off this impressions video with the reason why I dropped this game. The map designs in this game are trash. They're absolute trash. I think they're like the worst of the 3DS games. Like I said before, every map is basically killing every enemy. And this starts out okay. I mean, the maps start out a little boring and they're way too big and take a little while to get to fight all the enemies. But later they start adding these different terrain types. Once the desert environments start coming in, holy fuck, it gets frustrating. Where basically, the desert environment, you move slowly through it. So your characters can only really move like 1 or 2 square units. And this makes the battles last forever. The enemies are always on the complete opposite side of the map. And then they start adding in mage or witch characters that can warp. So they can cheat, basically, and cover like huge amounts of the map in no time, while you're reduced to moving square by square, unless you have like Pegasus Knights. Which Pegasus Knights are kind of weak anyways, so it's super helpful anyways. You have like the forest types, which make you move slow as well. You miss a whole lot more often in this game compared to previous Fire Emblem games, because the terrain types kind of judge your accuracy. And it's just, yeah, missing is something that's going to happen often in this game, and boy is it frustrating when it does. But the worst thing about this game, and the thing that completely ruined the game for me, are the Cantor enemies. And these are these enemies that at first they're in the maps ever so often. Not every map, just like every other map. And when you first encounter them, they're definitely frustrating and annoying, but not like a deal breaker. But the second half of the game, they decide to put Cantor enemies in every single map. And then they start combining them with the fact that it takes forever to get to where you need to go, like these desert tiles and these forest tiles. And the Cantor enemies are always on the far opposite end of the map, so it takes forever to reach them. And what these enemies do are spawn other enemies. Basically, every turn, they're going to consume some of their health to spawn 6 enemies, and it's always like 5 or 6 enemies. And this happens almost every turn. Sometimes they'll actually not do it. I don't know what determines them not spawning enemies. I couldn't figure it out for the life of me. But generally, every turn they're spawning enemies quicker than you can actually dispatch them. And a lot of times you can't dispatch them because you're on the opposite side of the map. You can't even reach them. So they all spawn beside him and then start moving down. And before they can even reach you, or you can even reach them, he spawns another 6. And they come down towards you. And then he spawns another 6. And it's this never-ending, demoralizing, horrible design that just I can't tell you the feeling I had anytime I saw the animation of these guys spawn 6 enemies, and I'm all the way across the map dealing with all these other enemies on the map. And the game's already hard enough as it is, and then they spawn these enemies, which they start out easy. The enemies they spawn, like they're simple terror type enemies, but later they actually start spawning the witch enemies that teleport across the map. Like, oh my god, it is the most frustrating fucking thing. It makes the battles last forever. What would be like maybe like a 30-minute battle gets stretched out to like a 2-hour tedious, just a completely tedious affair that I just despise. I can't believe how angry I got anytime I would see these enemies on the map, and anytime they would use their turn to spawn enemies. The hilarious thing too is, I said before, they actually use up their health to spawn these enemies, but they're always standing in spots where they heal all their health back. So they'll spend their health to send the enemies, and the next turn they'll heal all their health back and send another 6 enemies. And you have to actually kill them to destroy all their enemies. One good thing is that if you do kill the Cantor enemy, all the enemies they've spawned die. It's not a huge help though. And a lot of times when you reach the Cantor enemy, they don't move at all. And sometimes they can spawn enemies and they'll come out in front of the Cantor, so you can't actually reach the Cantor. And then you really have to attack them fast, because if you don't, they'll heal all their health again. This enemy, I don't know who designed this enemy. I don't know how this got through the game in the first place, but it is fucking abysmal. It is one of the worst implementations of respawning enemies I've ever seen in my life. And now I'll admit that this is a pet peeve of mine. It was one of the reasons why Prey was such a disappointment to me. But this beats it on a whole other level. It is just aggravating. It's tedious. It's fucking horrendous design. And compare this, or at least combine this with the map designs where you're just killing every enemy, and then the terrain always gets in your way. And there's always these choke points of like all these enemies, like groups of archers, groups of knights. Then the witch enemies that teleport. It's just, oh, the map design of this game was so fucking frustrating. I got to around the end of Act 4, so I'm actually close to the end of the game, but I got to this one map where there's just like all these Cantor enemies, and it was just like every fucking turn they were spawning more witches and more all these different types of enemies. And it got to the point where like an hour and 30 minutes into the map and I wasn't making any progress. And I was just like, fuck this, I'm done. This is not fun. It's aggravating, it's tedious. The story's not good enough to make me continue on. I'm done. I quit. Like, this is just not fun anymore. And that's why I dropped the game. I guess it's not a big deal for some people. Some people are able to get over it, and it's not that big a deal. Maybe some people even enjoy these enemies. I don't know. I fucking don't know. I can't comprehend how anyone can enjoy these enemies, but some people might. For me, it was enough to put down the game, and ultimately makes this game a huge disappointment for me. I had heard about these Cantor enemies in the reviews, but I didn't think they were going to be as bad as they are, and such a game ruiner for me. I know, but sometimes there's that odd design decision in a game where it completely overwrites everything else, and just completely will ruin a game for me, and this is one of those instances. It's really a shame. If it weren't for these Cantor enemies, this would have been a great game. I would have really enjoyed it, I think. It probably wouldn't have topped Conquest for me, but I would have enjoyed it and could recommend it. As it stands, if this sounds like it's not a big deal to you, I would recommend this game still. But other than that, I can't recommend it. The Cantor enemies completely ruin any sort of enjoyment you would get from this game. It's such a shame because I think this game has some interesting changes compared to previous Fire Emblem games. It's kind of refreshing in a lot of ways, and they just completely ruin it. But yeah, that's it, guys. That's my impressions on the game. Yeah, very disappointed by this one. And it's, yeah, the first game of 2017 I dropped. Prey, as much as I hated it, I still fucking I finished it. I still finished it. It was a frustrating experience. This game, though, I'm not bothering. In fact, I'm probably trading it in. Just because I'm so fucking angry with this. But anyways, guys, that's it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.